Thank you all for coming back this afternoon. Appreciate your commitment to the Lord and commitment to the church and all your support. I don't get to preach 2 lessons very often anymore. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to do so. I really enjoy it. It's amazing how fun preaching can be. Uh, it's kind of fun. I tell Loretta occasionally that preaching is and some of you may not get this, but preaching is kind of like an artist. And you've got an artist who starts off with a blank canvas and he's got all these different colors and he can paint whatever kind of picture he wants that day. He could have a happy picture with sunshine and rainbows or whatever, or he could have a gloomy, snowy scene that he paints that day. Just so long as you stay within the colors, I guess the preacher's kind of the same way. You have to stay within the word, of course, stay within the word of God. But you can present any kind of a lesson you want. It's a blank canvas. We can present whatever. And that's one of the things I love about it the most is finding unique ways to say the same thing you've heard 1,000 times. Because we've heard these things many, many times. And that's one of the challenges that I enjoy of preaching is to be able to come up with lessons that are relevant and things that we can actually, as Tim said in his prayer, take into your everyday life. That's what it's all about. I had the privilege, as you know, of being with Doug Roush for several years, and he and I would travel around to different gospel meetings. And by the way, I'm going to try to do that more this year because going around, as Jim said this morning in his announcements, going around to different congregations, you get, number one, the uplifting of the lessons and being there, but also those congregations appreciate that too. To have folks drive many miles sometimes to get there, to be there. And then the minister, the guy that's bringing the lesson, it's always been fascinating to me to see and hear the different styles and the different ways that these brothers deliver the lessons. Some of them are really, really intellectual and very, very intelligent, and they like to dig into the word and use the word and as more of a kind of a Bible study in their sermons in a sense, and they dissect this and they dissect that. And then you have just your ordinary Joes like me who just give it to you. I'm just going to give it to you straight. And I'm not really all that fancy. I'm not all that terribly good, but it is such an enjoyment to be able to do this. It's challenging, I'll give you that. And many folks kind of shy away from it, and I get it. I get why. But it's a joy. And I appreciate you folks letting me do this. It has been 8 years of probably the best years of my life in a lot of ways. Say all that to say this. Tonight's lesson is taken from 2 Timothy chapter 3. And this is one of those neat, interesting kind of lessons. I hope it's interesting to you anyways. But it's one of those interesting lessons that you can pretty much stay right in the text. These 5 verses say a whole lot. And we're going to look at these 5 verses tonight. And really, that's what it is. It's a warning from the Apostle Paul. And he's writing this letter to Timothy. And I preach a lot out of these letters like this because I can relate very well with a minister speaking to another minister. I've had a lot of those opportunities. I've got a lot of close friends that are other ministers. And we bounce ideas back and forth from time to time. We get together and share ideas. We share sermons. Here, I preached this last Sunday. It seemed to go okay. Maybe you'd like to tweak it and make it your own. And he gives me one. That's part of the brotherhood of being in the church. This kind of a lesson is one of those kind of lessons I believe is really relevant. That's the challenge, though, is to try to take something written 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago and make it apply to 2025. That's not easy. And there's a lot of things you have to work on in order to get those lessons to work out. Well, here's a 2,000-year-old lesson is what we've got tonight. A 2,000-year-old lesson, thereabouts, that is still relevant today. The things we're going to talk about tonight are the very things that you and I struggle with, and the world as a whole struggle with. We're going to look at that here tonight. As always, I'll have the scriptures on the board. I can encourage you to follow along in your Bibles as well as we read this first 5 verses of 2 Timothy chapter 3. Paul writes to Timothy, "But you know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. From such people turn away." Interesting passage there. And within that passage, there are 19 different things, 19 different warnings that Paul warns Timothy, and then Timothy then warns the church about those things. Tonight, we're going to look at some of these things and look at this phrasing that Paul uses here. And he says, in the last days, perilous times will come. Well, what does that mean? Are we really literally looking at our watch and our calendar saying within the next 2 or 3 days? We don't know that, but certainly what he's referring to is this idea of a dispensation. We'll look at that here in just a moment. But he says perilous times will come. What does that mean? Some of your versions might even say it this way: troublesome or harsh or bad times, you might say. Some versions might say it differently. But Paul is giving a warning here to Timothy: be on guard, be alert, because there's some troubles are coming down your road. There's going to be some tough things coming your way. This idea of last days, meaning a dispensation of time, a period of time, and that has been for, as we've said, roughly about 2,000 years that we've been in those last days, but yet it's still recognizing that we are in that last period of time. In other words, there's not going to be another dispensation of time coming. Whatever time, however long that period lasts, this is it. So Paul is writing to Timothy about this last age of time we're still living in today. Our lesson is going to look at those 19 different things. Now, I know that sounds like a long sermon, but we'll go through it fairly quickly. But I want you to hone in on those words and think about it. How do we know that we're in this last period of time? Well, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1 says it this way: God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets in other dispensations of time, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he's appointed heirs of all things, through also he made the world. So that's how we know that we're in this last period of time. You and I are under this dispensation of time. We're not under the prophets or the forefathers that had gone on before. We're now in those last days. Paul is telling Timothy that there is going to be tough times during that span of time that you and I are living in. Let's look at that again and read those 19 warnings that Paul gives Timothy. And you tell me if that's not so accurate today. Think about the things that Paul is warning Timothy of and see if they don't relate. I've always said that the church is a snapshot or a microcosm, if you will, of the world. We are separate from the world, and we try to live our lives separate from the world. But the problem is we live in the world. And sadly enough, the world sometimes creeps in the door. It comes in within us because why? We're in the world. And sometimes we don't live like we should. We live lives like the world lives. That creates a problem. Troublesome times are coming when we live that way. And that's where we're at today. That first admonition of Paul, that first warning to Timothy by Paul, was he says that men will be lovers of themselves. Is that true? Think about your world. Think about the people that you work with. Think about the people who you go to school with. Think about the people who you shop with. Think about the people who you interact with on a daily basis. Are they self-centered people? Generally speaking, yes. Now, there's exceptions to that rule. There are people that really have gone out of their way not to be, and I get that, and that's great. Brothers and sisters, that should be us. We should be working our hearts out to not be like the world and to be selfless people. But as I said, it is one of the most difficult things to do, isn't it? To leave the world and the worldly lifestyle that we are so accustomed to out there instead of bringing it into our lives. Paul says, and he warns Timothy, friends, brothers, and sisters in Christ, I'm warning you tonight that we need to be careful that we don't fall into the same trap. This is what he's saying is happening in this time frame. And this is nothing new. This has been going on for 2,000 years. There have been selfish people for 2,000 years and beyond. They're here today. Let's just make sure that we aren't one of these 19 things that he warns Timothy about. Are you selfish? You know, if you ever ask somebody, you come up to somebody and you shake their hand and you say, "Hi, how you doing? Are you selfish?" Absolutely not. Who do you think you are? The first thing you think of is, no. But are we? You see how it filters in? The worldliness that we live around eventually creeps in. And it's what you and I fight against every single day. You see how relevant the gospel is, even though it's 2,000 years plus years old. Men will be lovers, Paul says, of themselves. We live in a world and a society that it's all about me. We've heard the expression, so-and-so thinks the world revolves around them, right? It's exactly what Paul's saying. Be careful. There's times a coming that people are going to be just like this. Is that me? You know, sometimes it is. That's why lessons like this are so good. Go back with me to Acts chapter 2 and the very beginning of how this all started. And look what happened. And look how those early Christians acted and reacted to situations and problems. Chapter 2 and verse 44 says, "Now all who believed," that's those Christians, "were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all anyone who had need." Doesn't sound very selfish to me, does it you? Would you do that? Oh, now this preacher's gone from preaching to meddling. Now he's messing in my business. You see what we're doing? We're exposing whether or not we're really selfish or not. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple, breaking of bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church daily those who are being saved. Selflessness. Paul says, be careful. Warning, people are coming that are not going to be so selfless. They're going to be selfish. They're going to be lovers of themselves. We find also in Acts chapter 4, In verse 32, now the multitude who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own. Very selfish, selfless people. But that they had all things in common. Great power. And with great power, the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord. Great grace was upon them all. Nor was there anyone among them who lacked. For all who had possessions and lands and houses sold them and brought the proceeds to the things that were sold and laid them at the apostles' feet, and distribution to anyone who had need. Selflessness. That's what we're called to be. But too often, Paul's warning is spot on. Be careful, because there's going to be people out there that are going to be all about themselves. And you, whatever. See, is that not our world today? And sadly, is that not me? Sometimes it is. Must warn ourselves against such things. The second one, or else we will be here 2 hours, is let's move on. Is the second one, he says they're going to be lovers of money. It's kind of the same thing, isn't it? In a way. They're going to be lovers of money. And Timothy is told again by Paul, it's the root, the love of it. The love of money is the root of all evil. You can't be selfless and be a lover of money. It just doesn't work that way. It's the root of all kinds of evil. For some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through. Have we not seen folks, perhaps me at some point in my life, who left the church because of the pursuit of money? Absolutely. Have I done it? Yeah, I really have. Not proud of that fact. But you see, what happens is the world's influence begins to penetrate and it takes over. The warning is by Paul, there's going to be a time come where people are going to be lovers of money. Is that you? Is that me? Well, if it is, let's correct it. Let's not be that kind of person. But you, verse 11, O man of God, flee those things and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and gentleness. You see, the warning is awesome. It is true, isn't it? The warning that Paul gives Timothy is spot on. It was spot on in 2000, in the year, 60 or 70 or so, probably when this was written. And it's true today in 2025. Folks are going to do that. Be lovers of money. There's the warning. The next one is they're going to be boasters. People that just like to parade themselves around and they like to make themselves look better than they are. What does the Bible say about that? Well, we know Romans chapter 12 is an encouragement to us to present our bodies living sacrifices and to be conformed to the word of God rather than to be conformed to the word or to the world. And don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of mind. Verse 3. We don't often look at verse 3, but this is the key. For I say to you, through the grace given to me, to everyone who's among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dwelt to one a measure of faith. Why? Why is that so important? If you come off with that kind of an attitude towards folks, what kind of a reception are you going to get? Nobody likes a bragger. Nobody does. You can spot that guy a mile away. Oh boy, here he comes. What's he going to be talking about now? Have you not heard that? I've seen it. I've seen it in my own eyes, with my own eyes. Oh boy. And every time, first thing, they start running their mouth about how great they are, what all they've got, what all they've done, the possessions that they've got, whatever. Paul says, don't do that. Be careful. Troublesome times are coming. There are going to be people just like that. So true, isn't it? Boasters. The fourth one, proud. There's another one of those attitudes, personality types that just stinks. You can smell it on people. It's a pride. They think they're so superior. Proverbs chapter 16 says it this way: the highway of the upright is to depart from evil. That's your job. He who keeps his way preserves his soul. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. Interestingly enough, the Bible speaks a lot about pride. Never in one instance is it ever spoken of in a positive way. Pride will be the ruin of many, many folks. Think about the folks that you've come in contact with, and maybe even yourself, that has used pride as a way to not do the right thing. How many countless men and women are going to die and go to hell one day because of pride? Too many to count. They're so proud that they're unwilling to let you know that they've done anything wrong. They're certainly not going to admit that to God. Pride goes before fall. Don't let pride be one of those things. Isn't that so? It's so relevant to our life today. Blasphemers. Our world today is chucked full of folks that have taken God, taken his word, taken his respect, the respect that God deserves, and has pitched it out the window. And that's really what blaspheming is. If you define that word, it's the act of insulting or showing contempt or lack of respect for God in this situation. I can blaspheme you by doing the same thing. But this in particular context, we're talking about God. Don't we live in a society and a world that has no respect for God and his word, no respect for anything to do with religion? More and more, isn't it? Troublesome times are coming. You're in those troublesome times right now. We're living it, and there's going to be people like that. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for a necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. Number 6, disobedient to parents. Why is that such a big deal? Why does God care? Because when we're unwilling to obey our parents, it's really a slap in the face to anybody who's in authority. We have some men and women here in our congregation who are teachers and have been teachers in the past, administrators of schools. Was there a lack of respect for authority with kids? You better know it. I bet you they could tell you some stories that'll curl your hair. And has it gotten worse or better as time has gone on? Ask Mike. He's in the thick of it right now. Back in my day, probably one of the worst things you could do would be get caught chewing gum, talking out of turn, talking to your friend, or cheating on his paper, for the test or something like that. That was about the worst. I mean, there was other things, of course. But now what do we have? You see what it has done? Our society grows worse and worse and worse as it goes on. And now you've got metal detectors at the entrances of the schools so that these children don't bring in guns and knives and bombs and who knows what else. See where it has gone? Troublesome times are coming, Paul said. We're in it. We're living it right now. People who are unwilling. And then what you have is the parents who don't teach that respect to their children. So therefore, you got the tail wagging the dog in many cases, don't you? You got the parents being told what to do by the kids. Ought not to be. Paul's seen this coming, and he warned Timothy about it. Friends, brothers, sisters, I'm warning you tonight. It's the same thing. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Fear God and honor the king. 1 Peter 2. 17. Isn't this so obviously true, but yet sometimes we forget about how simple the gospel really can be. Unthankful would be one of those things that's coming as well. And we know that to be true, don't we? First Romans chapter 1 and verse 21, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful. But they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Someone who is unthankful. Ever done something for someone and then you get nothing in return? The deer in the headlight look. And you're sitting there thinking, hello? Are you there? What? Not that you do these things for this, but yet it's a part of being a human being and a Christian especially. Sometimes we're too self-consumed about ourselves, unwilling to look at other things. I got to keep going. Unholy. Is that our society today a holy society or an unholy society? Well, we know that answer, don't we? Paul said it's coming. It's going to be there. Troublesome times are coming. Guess what? He was right. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 21, and you who once were alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he has reconciled in the body, his flesh, through death, to present you holy, blameless, and above reproach in his sight. If indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you've heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, become a minister. That's the job of us all, is to become more holy. We sing songs once in a while, more holiness give thee. That should be our attitude. That's unfortunately, we live in a life, in a society, in a world, and sometimes church who's not holy. Number 9, unloving. They are just unloving people. Proverbs 22 and verse 5 says it this way: thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse, those who go away crooked. But he who guards his soul will be far from them. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from that. Where does this thankfulness, holy living, loving lifestyle and attitude begin? When they're about that tall. Because when they're that tall, you can control them. But when they get this tall, guess what? You're not going to have a chance. That's gone. Those days are done. And that's part of the responsibility of us parents, grandparents, uncles, nieces, aunts, grandmas, grandpas, whoever you are. Your job is to help train this younger generation. Look around. There's not very many of them around, are they? The church is losing that generation. And oftentimes it's because we haven't taught them to be holy. And we haven't taught them how to be loving. Too many have left the church. And Paul warned us 2,000 years ago, it's coming. And guess what? It's here. Here we are. Unloving people will be selfish. They won't care about authority. They won't care about all those things that Paul's already discussed. Number 10, unforgiving. Boy, have you ever done that? Where you've held a grudge against somebody? I hate to admit it, I have. Oh, it eats you up. If you've got any kind of a moral fiber about you at all, it just eats you like a cancer from inside out. And Paul said there's going to be people come along that are not going to forgive you. They're going to be unforgiving sort of people. So true. This text, which is an interesting verse, it's really taken from this bigger text from Matthew chapter 18, verse 21 through 35. we don't have the time to take that, but let me give you a bite-sized piece here of what that whole text is about. And see if you can't see yourself or others in our lives today in this text. Look at this again. Matthew chapter 18. Start with me in verse 26. You're familiar, I'm sure, with this, most of you. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will repay you all. Then the master of the servant was moved with compassion and released him and forgave him of the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, a smaller amount of money, and laid hands on him, grabs this guy, took him by the throat, saying, pay me what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down on his feet, at his feet, and begged him, saying the same thing he just said to his master, have patience with me, and I'll repay you. But what would happen? He would not, but went out and threw him into prison till he could pay the debt. Wow. Talk about unforgiving. That's somebody who just got forgiven of what they had owed, turns right around and comes after another guy who owes him a whole lot lesser amount and forces him to pay and throws him in jail because he wouldn't. That's unforgiving. That's the kind of people we deal with on a daily basis. They're not going to forgive. They want you to extend them all the grace in the world. But when it turns around, they're not there. Slanderers, we've been talking about that for the past couple of weeks with regards to gossiping, and it's this false accusation, false accusers, lying about others. So prevalent in our world today, and Titus speaks to that here. He speaks to that in chapter 2 and verse 6. He says, likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded in all things, showing yourself to be a pattern of good works in doctrine, showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say about you. That's our goal, is to get to that point where when someone says, if Jim Craig says it, take it to the bank. Guarantee you he's not going to lie to you. He's not going to try to pull the wool. You can take it to the bank. Can they say that about Jim? I think we can. But how about you? Put your name in there. Does the world look at you even? The people that you interact with take what you say and say, hey, if they say it, it's true. Too often, we don't have such a good reputation, do we? I got to keep moving. There's 19 of these, Number 12, without self-control. Oh, I could preach a whole sermon on this one. That everybody is just, seemingly out of control today. Look what Paul says. He understood this problem. He wrote it in the first place to Timothy. And now in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says the same thing. It's a problem. But I discipline my body and I bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified. Wow. That's one of those that hits close to home, doesn't it? Are we willing to discipline ourselves and bring our own bodies, our own selves into submission and subjection to God's word before we start trying to bring it on to others? I remember Doug Roush told me, most of you know Doug. We talk a lot about Doug, don't we? His ears must be burning down there in Kentucky. But I remember him, I was a young guy in late teens, early 20s, trying to figure out where I was going to go in life, just wandering around like son with no sense, which is what I was. And he's trying to convince me to get yourself together and start preaching. That's what you need to do. nah, that's this. And I remember him telling me, that started to kind of warming up to the idea as time went on, and he said, unless you're willing to get yourself right with God, don't preach. And I thought, well, that's kind of a, pushy thing to say. But as I thought about it, he's exactly right. Too many people want to stand up here and point the finger at you and tell you how bad of a person you are, and yet themselves not be what they should be. That's having yourself under control. Without self-control, God would not have us to be that way. Paul says, time's coming, people are going to be like this. Brutal, fierce, just bullies, just obnoxious, brutal people. I tell you, I do a lot of driving, as you know, for my other job. But as you start to see and you drive around, you just don't see very often people who are not willing to be just brutal bullies, fierce people. Romans chapter 12 says it this way: let love be without hypocrisy. Hate, abhor what is evil. Cling to what's good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another. Not lagging in spirit, not lagging in diligence, but fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. Oh, but if we could just do that. Troublesome times are coming, and there are going to be people just like that. Is that you? I had a buddy that was mild-mannered as he could be, just a super nice guy. But you put him behind the wheel of a car, instantly his attitude changed. He became like a nut. He became brutal, fierce, and he drove his car. Anybody that was in his way was just that, in his way. And he was just obnoxious. And I'm sitting over there in the passenger seat thinking, okay, hey, you can just let me out right here. I'll be good. I'll call somebody, I'm good. But as soon as he turns the key off, he changed. You see, that's what Paul's saying. There's going to be a time coming. There's going to be people like that, sometimes even in the church. Number 14, despisers of good. Boy, I tell you, we live in a world that anything that is good is bad, and anything is bad is good. It's exactly what the Bible talked about and warned us of. Paul says it this way: bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble, and do not be wise in your own opinion. Do your best to be good and not despise what is good. Number 15, traitors, people that just betray you. We've all had friends, probably quote unquote friends, who've betrayed us. What do we mean by that? Well, they acted like they were on your side, and then the first chance they got, switched on you and changed. Jesus went through the same thing with some of his very closest of the close, his 12. One of his 12 betrayed him. We know that to be Judas. We find that here in John 18. Jesus spoke these words and went out with his disciples over the brook of Kidron, where there was a garden in which the disciples entered, and Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place where Jesus often met, there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things would come upon him, went forward and said to them, who are you looking for? Who are you seeking? They said, Jesus of Nazareth. Here I am, he says. Judas, who also betrayed him, also stood with him. How do you think that made Jesus feel? Probably about the same way you would feel. Betrayed, just that empty gut feeling of like, oh, I thought that they were with me. You ever been betrayed? It's not pretty, is it? We're living in a world. Paul said, troublesome times are coming. We're here. Ever run across people that are headstrong? Oh, hard-headed? I mean, you can't talk to them. You try to talk to them, and they are like talking to this wall. You ain't going to penetrate it. Sad to say, Diane's nudging Tim, but I think we all could be nudged. We all can fall into that trap, can't we? Well, I tell you, so true. The way of a fool is right where? In his own eyes. But he who heeds counsel is wise. Don't be headstrong. Why is that such an interesting thing? Why does that matter that much? When I'm I'm a headstrong kind of a person, I'm not going to listen to God either. I don't listen to you. I'm sure not going to listen to God. That's why Paul is warning them, and we're warning you tonight. Troublesome times are coming. We're living in last days where there are going to be people that are headstrong. Don't be that person. Haughty, high-minded, to think yourself better than someone. Oh boy, don't you just love that? Are we not that way? A haughty look and a proud heart, plowing of the wicked are sin. 1 Peter 5:5, yes, all who be in submission to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Told you this before, but my grandma lived with us for a while when I was a kid growing up, and she was a old country girl from Kentucky. And her bedroom was right beside mine. So every morning I'd get up, I'd come out, you know how you are in the morning. Grandma's up crack of dawn. She's up 5 o'clock in the morning. She's been up for 4 hours before I even crawled out of bed. I'd crawl past her door, kind of shuffling along. The first thing she would say, Darren, don't you hi-hat me. Don't you? That's what high-mind, that's where the old people from Kentucky, that they called it hi-hatting you. In other words, you're just a little bit above everybody else. She would want you, first thing she wanted you to do is come right into her room, give her a kiss good morning, and say hi. How's everything going? Sometimes we're too proud and too selfish to allow ourselves not to be a little bit haughty. Sometimes with a current word is aloof. We're just a little bit too good for you. You're not quite good enough to suit me. Paul said, there's times a coming. People are going to be just like that. How about this one? Lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. Is that not, in a snapshot, our world today? Everything is about entertainment, sports, exercise, leisure, fun, vacations, going to the movies. Everything revolves around pleasures. Lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. Are there people that are not here today because of that? Yep. They enjoy their free time. They enjoy their day off. I'm going to stay in today. They enjoy the pleasures of this world more than they love God. Estimated, this is probably a fluctuating number, but it's estimated that Americans spend $2 billion with a B, $1 billion a day on entertainment. Think about that. And that's probably a conservative number. Our world revolves around fun and frolic, and by all means, we should have our fun. But what takes precedent? Is it getting ahead of us loving God? And oftentimes, it does. We enjoy our time free and time with friends and family, and that's great. But does it take precedence over God? Yes, many times it does. Have you ever stayed home from worship service? Because, well, I have family coming over. We're going to have a good time today. so I'm not coming. Is that not what he's saying? There's going to be a day come when people are going to be lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. We had a family of my aunt and uncle lived in Port Clinton area. We lived in Mount Vernon, Columbus area. And you could just about set your watch to it. Sunday afternoon, about 4:30, they show up. Hey, how y'all doing? We're gonna go. Let's go have some fun. And just in time for worship service that evening. What do you think happened? Well, my mom and dad, most of the time, would buckle. And they'd not go to church. They wouldn't go to worship. Well, because they drove all this way. And we certainly don't want to disappoint them. And we enjoyed their company. I loved them. They're really good people. Not godly people. They were good people. We love the pleasures of this world more than the pleasures of God. Paul said it's coming. Guess what? Look around. It's here today. And too often, it's here in the church. Last point. Having a form of godliness, but denying its power. We want to, down deep, we want to do what's right. We have a form of godliness, but really when the rubber starts to meet the road, we deny its power. And we put God second, third, fourth, 15th place. Having a form, it's defined as an outward show of pretending to be religious, but really we're not. Paul was right. We live in a world where people are these very things. And it's so obvious. Let's strive, you and I, to make a commitment tonight, today, to living our lives according to God's way. These lessons are, as I said, fun in a lot of ways because they're so relevant to you and I, my life and your life. Won't you tonight consider these things tonight with me as we all do? Maybe you're here tonight and you need prayers on your behalf. Look around tonight and see who's not here. Look around and see who's not here and make a commitment this week to reach out to them. What a difference that might make. To hear from somebody who they've never heard from ever before, and all of a sudden they go to the mailbox and lo and behold, here's a card from Darren Adkins of all people. What will that make an impact on somebody? Perhaps. Maybe so. You see, it's time the church starts taking being godly in a serious way. That's what Paul was trying to get Timothy to recognize, that there's a time coming where you're going to live in a world where that's going to be prevalent. We're here. What are we going to do about it? We're going to just allow ourselves to keep drifting and drifting further away from God, more into the world? Or do we drive a stake in the ground and say, enough is enough? We're not going to do that. We're not going to be influenced by the world anymore. I'm going to make this right with me and God. Won't you do that tonight as we stand and as we sing?